What started as a regal tradition quickly erupted into chaos. Royal Ascot, where pageantry masks power plays, witnessed a moment so raw, so unfiltered, it sent shockwaves through the monarchy. A defiant Prince George, standing tall before the Queen Consort, changed everything. The sun shone down upon Royal Ascot, but the atmosphere was anything but warm. Beneath the polished brass of royal carriages and the glittering fascinators of high society, there was an undercurrent of quiet unrest. All eyes were trained on the royal box, not for spectacle, but for signs. Signs of who held influence, of who would rise next in the House of Windsor's evolving narrative. Tension rippled beneath every smile, every subtle nod, every perfectly rehearsed gesture. And then, like a signal from fate itself, Prince George stepped onto the stage. Clad in royal formality, walking between King Charles and his mother, Catherine, the young heir appeared poised. But behind his composed expression, something far more powerful stirred. As the carriages arrived in stately procession, Camilla emerged with theatrical flair, her presence commanding as if the entire event had been orchestrated to honor her alone. She moved through the crowd with entitlement, expecting reverence not just from the public, but from her family. For Camilla, this was her moment, a symbolic assertion of her place at the top of the monarchy. Yet the mood shifted palpably when her eyes met George's. The young prince didn't flinch, didn't smile. He remained still, offering no customary greeting. The unspoken defiance hung in the air like a spark near dry timber. Observers whispered, puzzled by the breach in protocol. Catherine leaned down slightly to speak to her son, her expression unreadable. Anne, standing a short distance away, raised an eyebrow as if registering something deeper. George's discomfort was no longer something private. It played out in front of millions watching on screens, behind velvet ropes, and from within the walls of Buckingham Palace. There was no mistaking it, George was making a choice. When Camilla gestured, signaling a customary royal acknowledgement, George stood motionless. His refusal wasn't loud, but it was deafening. Camilla's smile faltered, her hand slowly falling back to her side. The tension between them was undeniable, and the crowd sensed it. What began as murmurs soon turned into a wave of reaction. Cheers, soft at first, then swelling, erupted from the onlookers. "Bravo, George!" someone shouted, and then others joined. Not a rehearsed cheer for monarchy, but a spontaneous outpouring for the courage of a child who broke ranks. The Queen Consort, accustomed to commanding respect, had been rebuffed by a future king before the world's cameras. And while the nation watched, hearts stirred not with judgment but with admiration. For in that singular moment, Prince George had reminded the world of something vital. That crowns may sit on heads, but power pulses through conviction. A child had just exposed a fracture in the House of Windsor. But what could make a young prince challenge a queen consort in full view of the world? The answer traces back to secrets buried beneath layers of royal tension. Protocol is sacred in the monarchy. But what if one royal heir decided to shatter it in front of millions deliberately, and with a deeper reason than anyone imagined? The bow wasn't just a gesture. It was a centuries-old tradition, a deeply embedded mark of loyalty, hierarchy, and submission. And at Royal Ascot, before the eyes of the press, nobles, and the nation, Prince George was expected to perform it flawlessly. As Queen Camilla entered the royal box and extended the faintest nod toward him, signaling her readiness, the stage was set. All he had to do was return the gesture, the one he'd rehearsed endlessly. But George didn't bow. He stood firm, unflinching. And with that, the unthinkable had happened. A future king had just defied the Queen Consort, and the world noticed. But this wasn't a spontaneous act. It was the climax of something that had been building in the shadows for weeks. Behind palace walls, preparations for Ascot had been strict and relentless. Camilla's camp had ensured every detail aligned with her vision of control, from seating orders to symbolic gestures. During rehearsals, George's hesitation was apparent. He had voiced his discomfort with the ceremonial bow, confiding in his mother that it didn't feel right. For a child trained to obey, it was a quiet rebellion. For Catherine, it was a dilemma. Supporting her son meant stepping outside the unspoken rules she herself had been forced to live by. But behind her composed silence was a mother's resolve, and she chose her son. Camilla, however, was not one to let resistance slide. The night before the event, she summoned George privately without Catherine. What was said in that cold, controlled encounter was never recorded. But royal insiders later confirmed Camilla's words were firm, almost threatening. She reportedly warned the boy that failure to comply would be seen as disrespectful to the crown. Yet the crown, in George's eyes, had long belonged to another, Diana. And George wasn't a child easily manipulated. That meeting didn't instill fear. It solidified his decision. What many didn't know was the role Princess Anne had quietly played in shaping George's conviction. As one of the few royals unafraid to speak bluntly, Anne had observed Camilla's growing dominance with unease. In the days leading up to Ascot, she had taken George aside during a walk through the royal gardens. Her message was simple: never bow to what doesn't feel honorable. She didn't tell him what to do, but she gave him permission to follow his truth. That permission would ripple through the monarchy like a shockwave. So, when the moment came, and George stood tall instead of bending, it wasn't just about a boy refusing a bow. It was about legacy, about lineage, about loyalty, not to the person in power, but to the principles passed down by someone the world had never forgotten. His silent defiance became a symbol, a new line drawn in the sand between Camilla's reign and the legacy of the woman she had long tried to eclipse. But this wasn't just about a bow. It was about a power struggle rooted in family betrayal, one that had been brewing long before the carriages arrived at Ascot. Camilla had long prepared for the moment when she could shape the next generation of royals. But Prince George wasn't about to be molded into her image. Within the grand but guarded halls of the monarchy, influence isn't just exercised through titles, it's passed down through whispered instruction, veiled mentorship, and calculated positioning. And ever since she claimed the role of Queen Consort, Camilla had one unspoken ambition: to shape the royal future in her own likeness. While the public assumed her role was ceremonial, behind closed doors, she had begun inserting herself into matters once reserved for Charles, or even the late Queen herself. But it was with the next generation, those not yet old enough to resist, that Camilla saw her clearest opportunity for control. And at the center of that plan was George. The tension between Camilla and Catherine had been simmering for years, but it flared the moment Camilla began pushing for changes to the children's education. Royal insiders whispered of private meetings where Camilla presented proposals for revised behavioral protocols, rules that subtly shifted the balance of power from parental authority to royal conditioning. She believed the children should show stricter allegiance to the reigning monarch and consort, framing it as modern monarchy refinement. But Catherine saw it for what it was, a disguised attempt to sever George from his roots, from his mother, and more devastatingly, from the legacy of Princess Diana. And George wasn't oblivious. He was perceptive, more than anyone expected. He began noticing when photos of Diana disappeared from certain rooms in the palace. He heard his mother speak about the woman she once called the world's princess, only to then hear Camilla casually dismiss Diana's impact as over-romanticized by the media. In one chilling moment, George allegedly overheard Camilla criticizing his grandmother, claiming the monarchy suffered because of her emotional outbursts. That moment didn't just hurt, it ignited something in him. The quiet affection he once showed toward Camilla began to wither. Even the royal aides noticed the change. George no longer leaned in when Camilla spoke. He avoided eye contact. During events, his posture stiffened in her presence, while it relaxed beside Catherine or Princess Anne. Every movement spoke volumes of distance, resistance, and a silent revolt taking shape. Charles tried to dismiss the signs, perhaps because acknowledging them would mean confronting the growing chasm in his own household. But George's allegiance was already formed. He wasn't just the son of the future king, he was the grandson of Diana, and that bond, though intangible, was unbreakable. And so, Camilla's plan, meticulously crafted to align the next generation under her influence, began to unravel. The more she pushed, the more George pulled away. The more she asserted control, the more his independence blossomed. What she hadn't anticipated was that her greatest threat would come not from a rival adult, but from a boy who understood legacy far more than anyone gave him credit for. As the cracks widened behind palace walls, Catherine faced an impossible decision: to silence her son or allow him to speak a truth the monarchy wasn't ready to hear. It was just a whisper that Camilla didn't expect, but Catherine's veiled warning shook her to the core. For once, the Queen Consort was not in control. As the royal luncheon commenced at Ascot, The atmosphere inside the private suite was thick with tension. Conversations were muted, strained. Camilla sat with a carefully painted smile, but the lines on her face betrayed unease. Her eyes flicked occasionally toward George, whose calm defiance earlier had not gone unnoticed. Every glance, every breath, held a weight too heavy for such a glamorous afternoon. Then, quietly and with the unmistakable poise she had mastered over the years, Catherine rose. She didn't make a scene. She didn't raise her voice. But her steps toward Camilla sent a jolt through the room. What followed would never be publicly documented, only whispered about in elite circles, described by aides as the most unroyal exchange they had ever witnessed between two royal women. They stood close, almost too close. No audience, no cameras, just two women bound by duty and bloodlines but divided by truth. Catherine, usually reserved to a fault, leaned in and spoke in a hushed but unwavering tone. Her message wasn't filled with accusations. It was something far more devastating. She told Camilla that George's decision to reject the bow wasn't disobedience. It was loyalty, not to the institution, not to the pageantry, but to the woman who had once been his grandmother, the woman who had worn the crown of hearts, not gold. "He honors the queen," Catherine said, "not the crown you took." The words were quiet, but they thundered through Camilla's carefully guarded composure. Witnesses later said Camilla was visibly shaken. Her eyes welled with tears, though she blinked them away furiously. She didn't respond. She couldn't. Because in that moment, she realized something she had refused to accept, that no amount of protocol, ceremony, or power could rewrite blood. George hadn't just acted on impulse. He had chosen a side, and Catherine had made it clear which side that was. The Queen Consort's title may have been sanctioned by coronation, but the future king had cast his allegiance elsewhere, and his mother was ready to protect him at any cost. Inside the palace, the exchange caused immediate tremors. Aides scrambled to recalibrate the narrative. Conversations about damage control began before the luncheon had even ended. The press office braced for leaks. Even Charles, who had long turned a blind eye to the silent feud between the two women in his life, reportedly asked to speak with Catherine privately. But she declined, her message already delivered. This wasn't about royal dynamics anymore. This was personal. And for many, it echoed the quiet, steel-like strength once embodied by Diana. The same courage to face a power larger than oneself, not with fury, but with truth. And now, it was clear. George had inherited more than just Diana's blood. He had inherited her defiance, her dignity, and her instinct to stand when others bowed. But just as emotions peaked inside the royal box, the outside world caught wind of the drama, and what happened next made headlines across the globe. As the carriage procession passed, the crowd witnessed something unforgettable. A young prince breaking ranks, raising hope, and rewriting history with a single gesture. The final parade at Royal Ascot was meant to be ceremonial, almost mechanical. A polished routine that unfolded with predictable grace horses, carriages, waves, and nods. But this time, the script unraveled. As the royals moved in formation, each carriage aligned with tradition. The atmosphere remained tense, still crackling from the events earlier that day. And yet, in the middle of the choreography, one unscripted moment shattered centuries of protocol. Prince George stepped forward just half a step, but enough to signal defiance, and when Camilla waved in his direction, his eyes didn't even flicker. Instead, with deliberate purpose, he turned toward Princess Anne and offered a respectful, modest gesture. One rooted in admiration, not obligation. That gesture was everything. For a split second, the crowd stood still. And then, a roar erupted. It wasn't polite applause. It was raw, emotional, eruptive. The kind of sound that doesn't follow royalty, it follows revolution. It wasn't just that George had snubbed Camilla. It was who he chose instead. Princess Anne, the woman many saw as the monarchy's most principled pillar. A woman who never played for the spotlight, but always stood for truth. George's gesture was no accident. It was a message. The future, he seemed to say, belonged not to those who forced their way in, but to those who had earned the people's respect. Camilla's smile faltered as her wave slowly returned to her lap. George, barely 10 feet away, smiled faintly. It wasn't smug, it was assured. His gaze lingered on Camilla for a moment. There were no words, But everything had already been said in the silence between them. The monarchy had been dealt a blow not from scandal or press intrusion but from within its own bloodline. Commentators scrambled to interpret what had just happened. Live broadcasts stumbled into awkward pauses. Some tried to frame it as youthful distraction, others as an innocent misstep. But the public wasn't buying it. Within minutes, social media exploded. The hashtags trended faster than palace staff could refresh their screens. "Bravo, George! Not my queen! Prince of the people." The moment had gone viral, not just across the United Kingdom, but around the world. Memes, tributes, edits of Diana and George side by side all surged through digital platforms like wildfire. And beneath it all, a common sentiment emerged. The monarchy had just been reminded that the people still remember, still care, and still choose who they believe in. George had done what no press release, no documentary, and no royal biography could achieve. He had made the monarchy feel human again, not by following the rules but by following his heart. In that brief moment of rebellion, he honored the past, rewrote the present, and hinted at a very different future. But while the people applauded George's courage, what happened that evening inside the palace showed the true cost of defiance. Behind closed doors, the palace walls trembled. Camilla demanded answers. Catherine stood firm. And George? He said something that left the room speechless. The cheers outside hadn't yet faded when a storm gathered within the walls of Windsor. Camilla, her authority bruised and her pride wounded, wasted no time. An emergency meeting was called private, urgent, and deeply personal. King Charles was summoned first, followed by William and Catherine. The air in the drawing room was thick with tension long before the door closed. What unfolded next wasn't a conversation, it was a reckoning. Camilla, visibly shaken, launched into a furious demand for accountability. Her voice was sharp, her frustration barely contained. She spoke of public humiliation, of the damage to the monarchy's image, of betrayal from within. Catherine remained silent at first, her expression unreadable. William watched, torn between roles, prince, father, son. And then, in a moment that would never be forgotten, George was called in. He walked into the room without fear. No bow, no nervous glance. Just the calm confidence of someone who had already decided who he was. Charles, hoping to restore order, gently asked the boy to apologize, to make things right. But George didn't flinch. He looked at Camilla, then at his grandfather, and said in a voice so steady it cut through the tension like a blade, "I'll never bow to someone who disrespects Nana Diana." The room went completely still. Not a single breath was taken. Charles, who had ruled with calculated restraint, was left stunned. He sat back in his chair, visibly rattled, and said nothing for the rest of the evening. Camilla, red-faced and trembling, tried to respond, but words failed her. The one thing she had never prepared for, the raw, emotional truth, had just been spoken by the youngest voice in the room. It wasn't protocol. It wasn't a rebellion. It was pain, truth, and legacy colliding all at once. Camilla stood abruptly, her composure shattered. Her voice cracked as she muttered something indecipherable, then turned and fled the room. An aide rushed to follow her, leaving behind an air of disbelief. The Queen Consort, once the strongest force behind the scenes, had just been undone by a child's honesty. But what made the moment even more powerful wasn't George's defiance, it was what happened next. William, long silent in the room, rose to his feet and placed a hand on his son's shoulder. Without needing to say it, his stance said everything. "I stand with him." In front of his father, in front of the crown. William chose truth over diplomacy, loyalty over silence. This was no longer just a family disagreement. It was a fracture. A visible, undeniable rift that had split the monarchy along generational lines. Charles, torn between wife and blood, sat frozen watching a new kind of royal leadership emerge before him. And he knew at that moment, control had shifted. With tensions now boiling within the royal family, a new player stepped in, one who had stayed silent until now. For years, she kept her counsel. But in the aftermath of George's rebellion, Princess Anne broke her silence with words that echoed across generations. It didn't take long for the dust to settle after the private confrontation, but the aftershocks were far from over. Inside the palace, the walls were still humming with uncertainty, and outside, The public was rallying around a new figure of hope, Prince George. But amid the swirling headlines and royal confusion, one voice had yet to speak. Princess Anne, the stoic anchor of the monarchy, the woman who had never chased the spotlight but had always commanded respect. Many had wondered where she stood in the growing divide. And then she made her move. Days after the confrontation, Anne paid a quiet visit to George. It wasn't ceremonial, it wasn't scheduled, it was personal, a simple gesture between an aunt and a nephew forged through mutual understanding. In that private moment, Anne praised George's courage, told him that real royalty isn't defined by crowns but by conviction. She didn't speak as a senior royal. She spoke as someone who had seen it all: betrayal, manipulation, sacrifice, and knew exactly what was at stake. For George, it was validation from the last person still standing with unshakable integrity. But the real shock came when Anne sat for a brief interview with a trusted journalist days later. While speaking on traditions, transitions, and the future of the monarchy, she slipped in a sentence that would ripple through the institution like thunder. Blood honors blood. Legacy isn't earned through titles, but truth. It was a line so potent, so pointed, that no one could mistake its meaning. The public didn't need clarification. They understood immediately Anne had taken a side, and it wasn't Camilla's. The quote exploded online. Social media erupted with praise. Editorials hailed Anne's words as a masterstroke of royal diplomacy wrapped in quiet rebellion. Hashtags changed course. Bravo George became Thank You Anne. Commentators dubbed it a royal rebuke with the sharpness of a sword. For Catherine, it was an emotional lifeline. For George, it was a sign that he wasn't alone. But for Camilla, it was a humiliation she hadn't prepared for. A blow not just to her pride, but to her perception of control. She had expected silence. Instead, she got a thunderclap from the one person she couldn't manipulate. Behind palace doors, the consequences became immediately visible. Camilla reportedly lashed out, feeling more isolated than ever. She complained that the institution was allowing her to be publicly undermined, even sabotaged. Tensions with Charles escalated. Staffers whispered that the Queen Consort no longer trusted anyone, not even those closest to her. The very alliance she had worked to build was crumbling under the weight of truth, loyalty, and legacy. What Anne did wasn't just support, it was a passing of the torch, a symbolic acknowledgement that Diana's spirit hadn't vanished. It had taken root in the next generation and was now protected by those who had never forgotten her. And through Anne's quiet but seismic stance, the monarchy found itself standing at a crossroads between tradition and truth. But as support gathered behind George, whispers of retaliation from Camilla's camp began circulating, and they weren't idle threats. Humiliated in public, rejected in private, and now cornered, Camilla wasn't done. But her secret plan to retaliate would backfire in a way no one expected. Beneath her wounded smile and fading public grace, Camilla was unraveling. The palace may have appeared calm on the surface, but behind gilded doors, her inner circle was hard at work, engineering a campaign meant to reclaim the Queen Consort's dominance, or at the very least, to damage those who had taken it from her. Leaked reports later revealed that Camilla's aides were quietly preparing a new narrative, one that cast Prince George's act not as brave, but as bratty. They sought to frame Catherine's parenting as overly emotional, unfit for royal discipline, and even dangerous for the monarchy's image. Their plan was subtle, strategic, and executed in whispers. Carefully crafted messages and talking points began appearing in the inboxes of select royal commentators, hinting at unroyal conduct from the Duchess and her son. It was nothing short of sabotage, masked behind the elegance of PR maneuvering. But the palace wasn't as blind as Camilla hoped. The Royal Communications Office intercepted these whispers before they could fully bloom. What they found behind the curtain shocked even the most seasoned officials. Internal emails between Camilla's staff hinted at targeting George's school reputation, implying the young prince was too influenced by media noise. Others proposed privately briefing royal-friendly outlets to suggest Catherine had encouraged defiance at Ascot as part of a personal vendetta. It wasn't just petty, it was cruel. And when word reached Princess Anne, she intervened without hesitation. She stormed into a crisis meeting with the press team, demanding the plan be shut down immediately. Her voice wasn't loud, it didn't have to be. Her authority was unshakable, and her loyalty to George immovable. William, upon hearing of the attempted smear, was livid. For years, he had stood at the uncomfortable intersection between his wife and stepmother, trying to balance tradition with peace. But this crossed a line he couldn't ignore. He confronted Charles with the full weight of his fury, not as an heir, but as a father. The confrontation, according to insiders, left Charles shaken. Pressed between the woman he had fought decades to legitimize and the future king who now stood as his conscience, Charles found himself paralyzed. The choice was no longer theoretical. It was staring him in the face. But Camilla's strategy had already begun to crumble. A palace whistleblower leaked key parts of the plan to an outside journalist, and the moment the press caught wind of the campaign, the story detonated. The public, already simmering with sympathy for George and admiration for Catherine, turned swiftly and sharply against the Queen Consort. Editorials accused her of stooping to palace games to protect a crumbling throne. Social media exploded again, but this time, it was laced with outrage. The monarchy, once again, found itself defending not tradition but decency. Camilla had hoped to regain control. Instead, she further isolated herself and fueled the very legacy she tried to erase. George's defiance became even more justified. Catherine's grace is even more admired. And the cracks in the palace walls are even more visible. But Camilla's defeat wasn't just political, it was symbolic, because the house she tried to rebuild in her image was about to be shaken at its very foundation. And just when it seemed the storm was over, a royal document resurfaced that would shift the balance of power once and for all. A royal archivist uncovers a letter buried in the past, written by Diana and addressed to her firstborn son. What it said shook the very soul of the monarchy. It was meant to remain private, a relic tucked away in the vaults of Kensington Palace, sealed not by order, but by sentiment. A letter written in 1996, just months before her passing, in Diana's unmistakable handwriting, addressed not to William, nor to Harry, but to someone who had not yet been born. "To the child my son will one day have," it began. The royal archivist who found it had no idea what he was holding until he read the final line. "Let him grow kind, brave, and true. And when the moment comes, may he stand for what's right, even if it means standing alone." That letter, long forgotten, now emerged as prophecy. And as it made its way into the hands of the palace once again, it became more than words. It became confirmation. The letter's existence was first whispered about behind closed doors, until Charles himself ordered it to be authenticated. It was real. And when presented to William and Catherine, there was no hesitation. Diana's letter would become the centerpiece of a royal tribute event marking her legacy. The letter wasn't read to the public in full. Only select lines were shared during the service. But even those lines carried the weight of 1,000 royal decrees. George, seated near the front, clutched a printed copy. And those close enough to hear said that as he finished reading it, he looked up at Catherine and said softly, "She knew I'd have to choose." The moment was quiet, but it didn't need spectacle. It needed truth, and this letter delivered it with devastating clarity. Diana had envisioned a moment just like this one. A moment where the future of the monarchy wouldn't be decided by advisors or agendas, but by the conscience of a child raised with compassion. George hadn't just rebelled. He had fulfilled his grandmother's wish, decades after her voice had been silenced. Charles, reportedly, asked to see the letter alone. Staff confirmed that he spent over an hour in his study, reading and rereading every line. And when he emerged, there were no statements. No press releases. Only the image of a king seen later wiping his eyes with a handkerchief during the tribute ceremony. For Charles, the letter was a mirror reflecting all he had lost, all he had buried, and all he had chosen. But for the nation, it was something else entirely. It was proof that the soul of the monarchy, once feared lost with Diana, had never truly disappeared. It had simply waited, quietly, for someone worthy to carry it forward. Public reaction was immediate and overwhelming. George's popularity soared not as a prince polished for headlines, but as a child who had faced down centuries of pressure and chosen legacy over obedience. The media now called him the Bridge Prince, the one who had linked Diana's past with the monarchy's uncertain future. Schools discussed him. Parents cited him. Young people looked to him not as royalty, but as a role model. And within palace walls, even those who once doubted him began to understand. He wasn't acting on impulse. He was acting on inheritance, the kind written in ink and sealed with heartbreak. The crown may rest on older heads, but after Royal Ascot, the nation knows exactly who their future king truly is. Thanks for watching. Don't forget to like and subscribe, and we will see you in the next one.